Welcome back to the Sustainable Jungle podcast. I'm Joy, and today I'm speaking with Dr. Saleem H. Ali, a distinguished voice in environmental studies, whose list of accolades and current roles is actually too long to list in this short intro. In this episode, we cover his educational and career highlights. We go deep on his new book, Soil to Foil, Aluminum and the Quest for Industrial Sustainability, which is applicable to a wide range of audiences from industry professionals to consumers. We also touch on COP28, climate change anxiety, and actions we can all take to build a better future. As always, you can find the show notes and important links for this episode at sustainablejungle.com/podcast. Now let's talk aluminum with Dr. Saleem Ali. Welcome to our podcast, Dr. Ali. It's a pleasure to have you. Let's start with a little bit more about you. Where were you born? Where did you grow up?
I was born in New Bedford, Massachusetts in the US. My father was a professor at the University of Massachusetts in the southern campus. Then I was taken back to my ethnic homeland, Pakistan, by my mother when I was 9. So I grew up in Pakistan. My father was still here. So every year we would come in the summer to the US. So I grew up in both countries, and it was quite an unusual but enriching childhood because I feel at home in both countries. I'm fluent both in Urdu and in English. And then after high school, I came to the US, and all my higher studies were in the US.
Right. Yeah, that is a very unique background. And I imagine that the two worlds are quite different. So I think you would have quite a different perspective on the world than the average person. And I've seen your LinkedIn profile, incredibly impressive, full of accolades and achievements. Perhaps you can share some of the highlights of your educational and career journey so far.
Thanks. So my first degree was in chemistry. I started off very much in the natural sciences, and that was at Tufts University in Massachusetts as well. And then I went directly to a master's degree in environmental studies, which was at Yale. And I focused, that's the point where I started to shift more towards the social sciences. I focused my work more on environmental law and policy. My advisor at Yale was at Yale Law School. So I felt, I had a good natural science background, but I felt temperamentally I wanted to be more in an applied social science field. Then after that, after masters, I worked for 2 years in industry. I worked at General Electric as an environmental health and safety professional. So that's part of the background also for this book, because I always wanted to write a book about industry, given my own experience having worked in industry at an important time in the history of GE when it was a huge company, much bigger than what it is now, one of the world's largest companies at the time. It itself has a very distinguished history founded by Thomas Edison, and, then diversified into such a range of products around, from aircraft engines to plastics to, GE Capital sold mortgages. And so this was during the time of the CEO, Jack Welch, where he was quite a legendary CEO who really diversified the company. And he was himself actually trained as an academic, one of the very few CEOs who had a PhD in his case, in chemical engineering. And then, but became very much, a bread and butter business executive. After that, I had 2 years at GE. I decided that my own interests were more in research, and I wanted to do a PhD. And so I went to MIT for my PhD in environmental planning, and then subsequently went into academia. And then most of my work, my career has been in academia with some consulting, some public sector roles with the United Nations and so on. So, yep.
And I saw you spent 11 years were you based in Australia, in the University of Queensland?
Yes, so I've spent time in Vermont. I was a professor at the University of Vermont first, and then I moved to Queensland. I was directing a research center at the University of Queensland on mining and social responsibility. And I'm still honorary professor in Australia at UQ. And then moved back to the US, partly, at a time when our two sons were getting ready for university. They wanted to study in the US. So we moved back in Delaware, provided a wonderful opportunity. So for past 7 years, I've been at the University of Delaware, where I'm the head of Department of Geography and Spatial Sciences, and continuing to do my other public service roles with the UN. I serve on the UN International Resource Panel. Yep.
A lot going on.
Yeah.
And to further add to that, before we talk about aluminum and your newish book, you've also written other books. So I thought maybe you could quickly touch on those and just highlight those that you've written previously.
Yes, thank you. So, my first book was based on my PhD research, which was on mining and indigenous conflicts, where I focused specifically on indigenous people in North America, in the US and Canada. And so that's very much an academic book that was published about 20 years ago. After that, I did several edited books. One of the first books on peace parks that was published ever, I did that. It was a book published by MIT Press that brought together scholars on this topic that had not really been explored in detail. Like, how can you use environmental issues to resolve conflicts, territorial conflicts, and so on. And then I wrote a sole-authored book called Treasures of the Earth, Need, Greed, and a Sustainable Future, which was around our relationship with minerals more broadly. And actually that book is what prompted a publisher to ask me to write the current one that you were interviewing me about. And I'll come back to that. But before that, the Treasures of the Earth was published in 2010. So that period, then I moved to Australia. I took a bit of a break from book writing for a while. I did one jointly authored book with my PhD advisor from MIT titled Environmental Diplomacy, which was written about international environmental treaties. And then I wrote a book more recently, which took about 5 years to write. That was my most ambitious book, which is on environmental systems more broadly. And it attempts to connect natural systems to social and political systems. And that one is titled Earthly Order, How Natural Laws Define Human Life. And that's written for a broad general audience, and certainly your audience may be interested in it, but it doesn't dumb down the science. There is quite a bit of science up front. And then I do give lots of personal examples, a lot of my own travels. I've been very blessed to have traveled to over 160 countries. I'm also a National Geographic explorer. And, so I bring in some of those aspects. And then after Earthly Order is the book that you were asked to talk to me about, is Soil to Foil, which is a deep dive on one element. And this was basically something that the publisher, Columbia University Press, contacted me. And they asked me about doing a deep dive on one element because they had read my book, Treasures of the Earth. And they said, yeah, you've written about minerals and our relationship with minerals as a society. Can you do a deep dive on one element? And I decided to do it on aluminum because aluminum is the most widely used metal in the most widely used applications. It's the most abundant metal in the Earth's crust, but it's one which was not easily discovered. There's this strange paradox that it's the most abundant metal, but it was not until the mid-19th century that we were able to really develop tools to extract it. And once we did, then everything changed. And so that's why aluminum is a fascinating metal in terms of understanding our relationship with consumption and sustainability more broadly.
Wow. And the book is called Soil to Foil, Aluminum and the Quest for Industrial Sustainability. I haven't actually read the book. Time hasn't allowed such a pleasure, which is why I love podcasts. So perhaps we could go a little deeper on some of the key topics. So first, I understand that it covers the history of aluminum and its ties to scientific and ecological process. Could you take us through maybe the highlights of that section?
Yeah. So, I start the book off with just giving the public, and it's written again for a general audience. I've tried to, I spent a lot of time actually working with writers through National Geographic Readers Circle, other ways. I had a writer's residency with the Rockefeller Foundation, Bellagio, where there were several writers who got together. And so I've tried very hard to make the writing accessible. And I start off with basically going back to the origin of the elements and to make the public understand why do we have different elements. And it essentially goes back to the Big Bang, when all the elements of the earth started to be created. Initially, at the Big Bang, you had only two or three elements, the lighter elements which were there. Then slowly, as stars formed, and you had different other processes allowed for other elements to form, and then I try to go through like why did aluminum end up being so abundant in the Earth's crust and so on, and then I go through. But that's the early part of the book, is very much that sort of storytelling around the origins of aluminum in the universe, and then I go into also how humans started to use aluminum. And that's a fascinating story because we didn't know it was a metal, as I was mentioning, till much later. But people were using alumina, which is a compound, a complex salt of aluminum, for a variety of purposes for thousands of years. Even now we talk about aluminum compounds are used in antiperspirants. Well, right. One of the earliest uses of alumina was as an antiperspirant. And even now in many parts of the world, you can get a little rock of alumina and people are, using it as antiperspirant. But also it was used as a mordant, which is a really interesting usage. I talk about that. Mordant is something, it's a compound which helps colors to stick to textiles. So, in the period of the ascendancy of the Catholic Church, I talk about how the church controlled a lot of the alumina trade because textiles were so important in ritual. So I talk about all these amazing aspects of the story of alumina before even aluminum as a metal was discovered. The color purple, one of the reasons it became so important as a royal color was because the modern alumina was used and it made the dye for purple stick so well to the fabric. And the purple dye, originally the most famous purple dye came from the biological excretions of a snail in the Mediterranean. And it was in Tyre, which is a city now in Lebanon, where they call this the Tyrian purple, where they would bring alumina trade and the snail was harvested and they made purple fabric. So, it's just an amazing story of how the elements relate to our daily lives. Then I talk about, eventually how aluminum as a metal was discovered. And that's a fascinating story because it was discovered independently by an American and a Frenchman. The American who discovered it was far more successful because he was very business savvy, but he was an undergraduate student at Oberlin College in Ohio, which is also wonderful for my students as an inspiration that as an undergraduate, you can do great things. He discovered the process whereby you could commercially extract aluminum metal using a very specific kind of catalyst and a mineral called cryolite, which he was able to add to the process. And that allowed for aluminum metal to be extracted. And that completely changed the game. That one process allowed aluminum to be so ubiquitously used in things like foil, hence the book's name, Soil to Foil. Imagine a metal being used to wrap your sandwiches. And that happened because of this man, Charles Hall, his name was, his remarkable ingenuity. And he had a business savvy too. He also became the first CEO of Alcoa. He was the founder of the company Alcoa, which is still around. It's the world's, leading aluminum company. And so I tell that whole story, though, and then how the mining of aluminum happened, the environmental consequences of that, the other various ways in which the metal has been utilized in the military, why it became such a strategic metal during the world wars. The only source of cryolite, the mineral that was used to catalyzed the process for aluminum extraction, was mined at one site in Greenland. And that Greenland mine during the World Wars became a huge, especially during the Second World War, became a huge strategic asset for the US. And there was a military base established just to protect that mine. Later, they found a way to have synthetic cryolite made so that they wouldn't have to mine the resource. But so it's a fascinating story which connects so many different areas of human endeavor.
Yeah, I had no idea about 99% of that, so that's enlightening. I think our audience would be very curious about the mining in particular, because obviously mining has a bad rap from an ecological and societal standpoint in general. Has aluminum's history been any different from your typical mining story? And what have been some of the major impacts?
Yeah, so aluminum is mined a little differently from other minerals because the ore is essentially, it's like in soil. That's why it goes soil to foil. It's bauxite ore, which is, so you find it in this sort of conglomerate material, often in tropical areas where it's been washed out through different sedimentary processes. And so a lot of aluminum ore is mined in islands, in tropical, wet, humid climates. So you find aluminum, that some of the largest resources of aluminum are in places like tropical parts of Australia, in Guinea, in West Africa, which has now the world's largest economically viable aluminum reserves. In Suriname, historically, during the World War period, Suriname and Guyana, which is now British Guyana, then Suriname used to be called Dutch Guyana, they were huge resources of aluminum. And again, very strategically important at the time, which justified, in some cases, colonialism continuing there. Jamaica, the island of Jamaica, has had huge aluminum reserves. And so during also, that's been a rather sad history of that period where the aluminum was mined. Many of the farmers, their lands became unusable. And I tell that story as well in terms of the mining. So it has had an impact negatively in many cases. But I think there are ways in which we can ameliorate that. There is also the processing of aluminum, which causes sometimes these huge waste dams to be made. And that the waste is often termed red mud because a lot of the soils from which aluminum comes are these iron-rich soils which have the red coloration. So you may have heard of the accident which happened on the Danube River in Hungary, where there was the spillage from a bauxite facility. Those kinds of incidents are also noted. So I try to provide a very balanced perspective. This is not a book which is meant to be just disparaging of industrial activity. I think industrial activity is absolutely the foundation of modern society, and of course it has changed the earth in irrevocable ways, and that's why we are calling this the age of humans, the Anthropocene in geological terms, by many of the scientific community. But at the same time, I do want to acknowledge all the harms that have come from it, and that what we can do to mitigate those harms.
And let's talk about that, because your book obviously makes that link to sustainability right there in the title. So what does the best version of the future look like for aluminum?
So ultimately, with all the elements of the earth, we want to follow natural cycles which are circular. We want to see if the elements can be brought into some kind of a circular supply chain. So aluminum also in the same way. Ideally, you would want that it can be recycled, it can be reused, the materials can be remanufactured that have aluminum in them. So you reduce the amount of energy that is used to bring it back into the system. And so that's the goal. For sustainability, we often talk about the material energy nexus. For any kind of material, you need to invest energy to extract it, to use it, and then to put it into waste, or to hopefully bring it back into useful production. And for that, where does the energy lie? Now, with aluminum, you need a lot of energy to extract it. So there has always been an economic incentive to recycle aluminum. And even in the early days of Alcoa, they wanted to have recycling because they knew that the production itself is so energy intensive. The smelting of the aluminum ore and so on requires much more energy than most other metals per unit output. That's why a lot of the smelters are in areas where you have cheap energy. Alcoa built its smelters near hydropower plants in upstate New York or in Quebec, Canada. Or in Norway, we have Norsk Hydro, which is one of the biggest aluminum producers because Norway has cheap hydropower. Or Iceland, which has great geothermal power. So that material energy nexus in the case of aluminum was very stark, more so than with other metals. And that has led to a greater consciousness around sustainability with this metal. So I talk about that also in terms of how it has come about with, various uses of aluminum, especially aluminum cans, which are widely recycled, not as much as they should be, but still widely recycled.
The only thing I knew about aluminum before coming into this conversation was that it can be recycled indefinitely, which I understand is quite a unique attribute. I'm not sure if that's the same for all metals or if that's just sort of more in context versus plastic.
Well, it's but not indefinitely in the complete sense, but yes, functionally, yes, it's it doesn't rust or oxidize in the same way that iron does. And so that makes it also very valuable because it aluminum forms a thin coating of aluminum oxide when exposed to air, which prevents it from being further impacted by the elements. And so that has made it very resistant in many cases, but not completely so. The book touches on some of these little known facts about the various consumer items around aluminum. So, for example, aluminum cans, we don't often know that they have a thin plastic coating because even though aluminum itself is pretty resilient, if you're going to put something acidic in it, which you would like with soda, which has phosphoric acid in it, it's eventually going to corrode. So actually to make the cans functional, there's this very thin coating of plastic which is put on them. But the public often doesn't know about it, and that has certain consequences environmentally. And figuring out how, what we do. I also talk about techniques of comparing what are the good uses of one material versus another. So aluminum cans have a lot of value. In certain cases, they're great for high pressure storage of liquids. But in other cases, glass may be better also. Glass is heavier, but it doesn't have some of these other attributes so that you're using plastic to do the coating. The energy footprint may well be less for production. In other cases, aluminum is used also in Tetra Pak, which is the kind of cardboard containers often we don't realize, but that has aluminum in them, but they're used widely. These little juice containers you give to your kids for lunch, or in the developing world, milk is stored in Tetra Pak because you don't need refrigeration. It has a thin aluminum coating inside. And that has been a very productive, useful way because it has provided milk and dairy products in places which don't have the energy resources. So I talk about all these sort of panoply of different uses and how the consumer might want to think about their sustainability imprint.
Yes, because it's just not straightforward. There's trade-offs on recyclability versus functionality, and Tetra Pak's famously difficult to recycle, or at least that's sort of the what the media reports on. I've just seen in Australia they've opened a new Tetra Pak recycling facility, converting Tetra Pak into building materials. In place of sort of board to go into buildings. So but it can't be sort of recycled back into the same materials that it was created with. I've seen the little cans starting to get little labels on it saying BPA free and all that kind of thing that obviously comes from the plastic coating. So I imagine that also creates some difficulty in fully being recyclable as well. It's tricky.
Yeah, I mean that, whether it's upcycled or downcycled and recycling, that's the key thing that you want to, if you upcycle it, you're making the material as good as its use previously or maybe better. So in upcycling, you could make some durable product out of the recycled material. People can make furniture out of old metal. And that's a form of upcycling. And recycling, which is going to downcycle, is when you convert it into a slightly inferior form. So that's also important for consumers to be aware of.
Yeah. You mentioned that Alcoa was interested from an economic standpoint in recycling right from the beginning.
Yes.
So what went wrong? Is it just that it's just so complex and the use cases are so wide and the mixed materials become so difficult to recycle? Is that what sort of prevented a wide recycling rate? Or what was the sort of main reason why that didn't?
They have the infrastructure to recycle, and they've done it's the main problem with recycling of any material is if it becomes so diffuse, how do you collect it all and you get consumers to change their behavior, or you find a way to mechanically extract it from the waste stream then. And that's why we don't get the same rates. They tried different techniques with aluminum cans. What was very successful earlier on was the deposit schemes where people put, 5-cent deposit and then you add it on. And, even if if people threw it in the trash, the incentive for people who were otherwise impoverished was to go and literally look in the trash and find the cans and get them recycled. As the incentive for these deposit schemes has waned, that has declined, and you do get people throwing cans which will end up in the landfill. Once it's in the landfill, it's very difficult to extract the metal. It becomes very expensive to do that. So that's the real challenge, is because as you have so many products, then it becomes more difficult to bring it back. If you have fewer products, like for example, a lithium-ion battery in your electric car, that's much more likely to be recycled. Or even a lead-acid battery. Most lead-acid batteries in your cars are recycled because it's very easy it's one place. A car, when at its end of life, people are going to take the battery. Or even when you go to have your battery replaced, there's a whole very easy supply chain for that. It's more difficult with diffuse products.
Yeah. I've started in our area. I've seen 2 container return schemes pop up recently, like in the last couple of months, which is quite exciting. So I'm hoping that's a sign of a resurgence in that scheme. But I wanted to ask you, so what are some of the examples of more sustainable approach to aluminum? Who's doing it well? What are the innovations? Where do we go to from here?
Yeah, I think with reference to the production and reuse, Norsk Hydro is a really interesting case of a company that has innovated in terms of efficient usage. They've also got, even from a recycling point of view, developed plants so they can more easily extract material from waste collectors. And so I think they are really the benchmark in many ways. The aluminum industry has set up what they call the Aluminum Stewardship Initiative. And I do talk about that in the book. I interviewed the current head of the initiative, who's actually Australian and based in Melbourne. They have been leaders in that space around the metals industry, trying to be more sustainable. And they have companies all over the world, including in China, which are partners. And that's also, I talk about in the book, the geopolitics of metals. Many times there are these assumptions made about one country has a poorer player than the other. I think we need to look at each case specifically.
And Dr. Ali, aluminum was the element that you chose for various reasons, but I imagine the principles and concepts can be extrapolated into other important resources. Is that how you think about it? And if so, what are the key messages that readers should take away when they're reading this book?
Yes, no, absolutely. The goal is, that's why the subtitle is, the quest for industrial sustainability, as I say. And aluminum provides us many of the same lessons that can be applied to any elements of the earth, certainly all metals, but also other materials, in terms of how we first consider which products we should be manufacturing from the material. uh, what are the techniques we can use to compare the use, such as life cycle analysis, as I was mentioning. But then also looking at it from the point of view of a circular economy in the long run. How can you get circularity from the use of those materials? How can you be more resource efficient? And then also how you can think about the communities where the material is coming from, and whether this can be a source of development for them. So, for example, a country like Guinea, where you have aluminum mining, it's very similar to learning from the Pilbara in Australia, where you have iron ore mining, and how has that helped to develop Western Australia, whether it's with the Aboriginal communities and how they have both been impacted negatively as well as benefited. The largest employer of Indigenous people in Australia is the mining industry. After the public sector, of course, government is always the largest employer in a place like Australia. In outside that, it is the mining industry. So, can they play a constructive role? If so, how? And how do you try to mitigate the risk? Because we do know that there are risks from these activities. So the same lessons can be applied certainly in a range of other venues, at the point of extraction, manufacturing, processing, and then end of life, and hopefully circularity.
And you mentioned that this is a book that sort of anybody could find interesting. It sounds like it's got more of an industrial bent, in that it could be used as an advisory piece on how to do this better if you're thinking about this from an industrial capacity, not only sort of for the big producers of these products and even those further upstream pulling the aluminum out of the soil, but also for consumers making decisions on what products they buy and how they play a role at the other end of the scale. Would you say that's a fair summary?
Yes, that's what I found so reassuring when the book came out, that it has endorsements from very different quarters of the professional spectrum. It got an endorsement from Bill McKibben, who's a notable environmental writer, the founder of 350.org, very strident in his views about industry. But it also got a cover endorsement from the CEO of the International Council on Mining and Metals, who's very much an industry guy, a business professional. And then it got a cover endorsement also by a notable academic who works on mining and sustainability. So that has been very, for me as an author, it's a source of some gratification that, it has been accepted by a wide spectrum of people who might not always agree with each other.
We need more. We need more communications like that, right? Where we connect different groups of people who really don't understand the perspectives of the other groups. So fascinating, and I imagine very satisfying. And building on that topic, for you at a personal level, I know that you were asked to do this book, and that idea was sort of presented to you. But why did you agree to do it? Sort of what's important about writing this book? What was important to you about writing this book?
Yes, so what was important for me first was that I get the science right up front. And the publisher is Columbia University Press, but it's through their trade listings, so that it's accessible and, priced in a way that the general public can afford it. And so having a university press is always good for an author like me who wants to get the science right, because they do peer review. Even for a popular book, they will go through a peer review process. So this book has been very diligently reviewed for the accuracy of the science, which is not always the case with many of the big trade houses. So that was very important because the first part of the book especially has a lot of natural science and understanding of the elements, origins, and so on. For me, the other part was getting that balance between detail and accessibility. So, you want to provide enough detail that you don't feel that it's been dumbed down, but you also want to not make it too cumbersome for the reader. So that finding that right balance, and everyone has a different way. I think unfortunately the public has been kind of mollycoddled by a lot of the journalistic type of science writing, into not trying to wrestle with some difficult concepts. So everything gets presented as somewhat of a linear story. And then you get reviewers who will say like, oh, this is a bit academic, and just because it has nuance does not mean it's not readable. But just as soon as you begin to feel a little strain on like, I have to think more, the reviewers get, and that's been finding that balance for me was really tough because I did want it to be widely read, but I didn't want it also to be one of those fluff science books where, I have these good one-liners and I've got, make it more like a self-help book. So that is, it's a challenge. And I'm trying to push journalists who review books to appreciate that because there isn't. And this is a problem even with book agents. Because the book agent, and I deliberately did not want to go with the book agent for this because I did go with one from one of my earlier books. And they really changed the narrative because they want you to dumb it down much more. And I think that's insulting to the public, really. I think the public is smarter than we give them credit for. But we just have made them more languid into, having these kinds of very linear narratives. So that's the kind of, process I went through in constructing the book. But I hope that it will find that balance, that sweet spot. There's enough storytelling. There's enough of that sense of wonder. But at the same time, there is the scientific depth and quality. Lots of figures. The book has a lot of diagrams and all to help the public understand, some photos, things like that too.
I think bringing in nuance is what we're missing more generally in society. I think that's having nuance. We're so used to sort of just seeing the headline, social media, like the one-liner on things, but there's so much that sits behind it. Even just discussing the trade-off between, your metal can and the plastic lining that goes into it. Like there's so much that sits behind that there is to understand. There's nothing is super simple. So I can appreciate the importance of why you wanted to get that right. Now zooming out maybe a little bit to talk more broadly, you were having this conversation smack bang in the middle of COP28, and I saw your X feed that you were there on the ground, and it feels like we can't not talk about what's happening there, given you were actually there. So, if you don't mind, what were some of your key celebrations or frustrations from this year's event so far?
Well, at COP28, my interest was partly on decarbonization of the metal supply chain, the mineral supply chain. And I also, one of my other public service roles is I serve on the Independent Governance Committee for the Dubai Multi-Commodity Center, which is the free trade institution that allows for a lot of commodities to be traded in Dubai, including metals and especially gold. So my role, along with 5 or 6 other professionals, is to try and monitor and ensure that the gold coming into Dubai is getting better sourced, because there's been a lot of concern about laundering and also the environmental social impact of the sources of the gold. So we had worked on a report on decarbonization of the gold mining industry itself. So that was one of the reasons I was there. So right now at COP, unfortunately, what I found was that there was much more heat than light being generated, because you had these on the one hand, the environmental activists who are really intent on stigmatizing the host country in terms of the fossil fuel economy. And I can see where they're coming from, but I do feel that they needed to show a little bit more benefit of the doubt being given to the host to see what can they do better, because right now we don't have an easy transition out of fossil fuels. We do need to figure out a path which allows for that material energy nexus I've been talking about. If you want to transition to renewable energy, you need a lot of materials, and that material energy nexus needs to be better realized. You can't also just reduce consumption, because there are a lot of developing countries who have to develop. You can reduce consumption in rich countries, but we still have 800 million people who don't have access to electricity. You have even more people who don't have access to a functioning toilet at home. So, what can we do to build our development infrastructure in a low carbon context, but it will still require a lot of materials. So I think that part of the conversation at COP needs to come out better. It has not as much because of all this heat generated intellectually as well as physically by the issues around fossil fuel. The term they have been saying is, should we be phasing down or phasing out fossil fuels? And of course, ultimately we should be phasing out fossil fuels. But what is a realistic way to do it, given that you have all these development imperatives? And then whether we need to have technological solutions to sequester carbon while we find the materials to develop the renewable energy infrastructure. But the environmental community doesn't want to often talk about the carbon capture, usage and storage, as it's called, because they feel it's a moral hazard. If people think of that, then they're not going to mitigate, their emissions. So this has become a real unfortunate context of the situation at COP. I think as a scientist, I see the writing on the wall really that we will need to have multiple approaches, and we will need to have some sequestration, mitigation, and we will also have to probably adapt to a warmer world, because we won't be able to move fast enough. And that conversation at COP also in the next week or so, hopefully will be gathering momentum about adaptation and funding adaptation much better. As well as on the technologies, the CCUS technologies. After COP, I also I went to the early days of COP, and then I went to Australia before coming back just 2 days ago back to the US. In Australia, I was there for the launch of a new center, an Australian Research Council Center of Excellence on what they're calling the green electrochemical transformation of carbon dioxide. It's get CO2. So the goal is that, because we are in this real predicament that we can't reduce emissions because of the development problem, at least let's try to reduce the impact of CO2 and capture it and use it for something useful. Not just bury it, which is the carbon capture and storage, but actually use it for products. And so the Australian Research Council has invested in this. It's about $35 million over the next 7 years to develop these technologies where we can do that. So that is part of the COP conversation, which is going to be carried to the next step of technologies. And I am also involved with that research center. I am the social scientist who's trying to help them. Because of my chemistry background, I understand the technicality to some degree, but to help them see how can we do this so that the public accepts it, and we can also have a much better outcome overall from a systems perspective.
Very cool. Fascinating, and feels important. Very important. We actually interviewed the head of sustainability for Interface on the podcast a little while ago. And she was telling us about the carbon negative tiles, embedding carbon in the actual carpet tiles. But I
Yeah.
imagine there are much bigger scalable opportunities to use carbon at a much bigger scale.
Yeah, that's the goal, is if we can take the CO2 out when it's being emitted and then make useful products, whether it's just methanol, and make acetate, and then that acetate can be used for a variety of uses. And so, but even those electrolyzers will have materials we need. So we have to think about the material energy nexus there as well. And that's been my constant calling cry. I wrote a little editorial in the journal Nature a few months ago, and it said there's no free lunch with clean energy. We have to look at it. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. It's just that we have to be aware of it. We can't be glib about it, that we'll suddenly get this transition without some pain. We will have to make some trade-offs. It's not going to be suddenly that we will be able to transition. And sometimes you hear people who are in the wind and solar industry like, it's all there. We need the political will to do it. It's not that simple. Even if energy efficiency, which people like Amory Lovins, who is a wonderful, public intellectual, he talks about, we can just solve it with efficiency. Even the efficiency aspect is going to require enormous investments in different ways of how we are going to manage the grid, whether the efficiency itself creates a rebound is another concern, because you still may get more consumption if there's that. There really needs to be a recognition about the importance of trade-offs and where we make those trade-offs.
Yeah, it's the biggest transformation, arguably, in modern history. And it's not going to come easily. We probably left it a little late to do it perfectly, right? We have to kind of just get into it and get it done. And as you say, there's going to be trade-offs in the process, which are in some cases going to be ugly, and that's not ideal. But we just have to do it at this stage. On a similar topic, I see also on X that you're quite vocal about climate change, our collective lack of climate action. Do you personally feel climate anxiety, and if so, how do you approach dealing with it? And if not, how do you avoid it?
Yeah, I mean, there is certainly anxiety. I come from Pakistan, where we have had some of the hottest days recorded ever in any location, and if you do not have the adaptive mechanisms, that's very scary. But the good news is that humanity has adapted to unfavorable climates for many thousands of years, and in fact, in most cases, the adaptation has been around very cold climates that and this is something that bothers me, is that people say, well, this city will become uninhabitable because it's too hot. That's not an accurate statement, because if by that measure, most of the world's major capitals are uninhabitable because they're too cold, like Moscow or London or New York or Beijing, or Tokyo. They are all in winter. They're too cold. You couldn't live just outside without some adaptive structures. So if we can adapt to too cold, we can adapt to too hot also. We will need, of course, adaptive structures. We would need to change our architecture. We may have to build more subterranean dwellings. In Australia, Coober Pedy is a famous example of that, a city which was built subterranean, but, the opal miners figured it out. You build it so hot outside, you figure out a way to develop. We can do that. So I think we need to be concerned, but we should also not be panicking to the level where you get this despair among our younger generation. It just means planning is needed, adaptive structures are needed. Where mitigation is possible, of course, that should be a priority. But ultimately, it's clear to me that now we will have to adapt. We will have a warmer world, and we have to plan for that adaptation. So that's how I deal with it. I'm concerned, but I'm not going to let this, lead to despair by any means.
What would you recommend the everyday person do to help? Are there things that the everyday person can do to help? I think a lot of people do feel that despair and sort of don't know where to turn, or don't know how to sort of change the story from an individual perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think the ultimate thing the individual should first do is inform themselves, because without the information, they will make errant decisions. Invest a little bit of time in learning, and I'm even suggesting we need an eco literacy requirement. And it's not just about awareness. I often say we have environmental awareness, but we don't have environmental literacy. People don't understand the science well enough.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the first step. I think we should have that at the earliest stage in our curriculum, to have environmental literacy inculcated with students. But then what can they do individually is, it's often those incremental decisions about consumption choice. Figuring out what you are consuming, first of all, to see whether this is something that is coming from a responsible supply chain. But that is also incumbent upon then the authorities to ensure the consumer has that information. So it's a little bit of both coming together.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the other big lesson from Soil to Foil, the book, is that consumers need to think in terms of circularity for their own lives. What can they use? As durable as possible, the material. And what makes aluminum so special is it's very durable. So if you can develop material and be consumers who can use more durable materials for a longer period of time, you're going to reduce your impact. We have at home a desktop, a computer, which is made of aluminum, and as long as the kind of uses, it's more than 10 years old. I don't see why we need to replace it as long as it's working. It required servicing a few times in terms of the processor. We had to do some memory cleanup and so on, but we are not using it for massive digital video processing and so on. We use it to check email. We use it to store photos, view things every now and then. It's fine. So, that's a form of circularity. First form is you try to make the durable usage as long as you can. And then you think about, if not, then how do we have it go back into. So I think the consumer needs to think in those terms, and those are simple things which you can do. Increase the lifespan of what you are using for as long as you can, and then find other ways of helping communities that might be affected. One of the arguments for what we call planned obsolescence, where things are constantly made obsolete, is that people need jobs. Someone's got to produce them. Well, we have to, as consumers, figure out a way to motivate companies to service rather than produce, and still make jobs. You could have people who service durable products and still have livelihoods, rather than having to manufacture constantly new products. So that's also something. The only trade-off there is innovation. Sometimes you need to have new products because they're more efficient. And that's fine. But you have to figure out whether you are really adding that much efficiency. And a lot of times now we're reaching a plateau with new innovations. Most computers are not much more efficient than the previous one now. So we have to think about whether the same is true of cars. They're not like much better. They're reaching a certain point. So we should be increasing their lifespan. And instead, a lot of those jobs which were in production should go into servicing.
And surely there's an argument for innovation using upcycled materials from the loop, right?
Yeah,
so
absolutely. Figuring out how to have, whole economies around upcycled material too.
Yeah. And the actual innovative products can use upcycled materials. It doesn't have to stop innovation. In fact, it adds to the challenge of innovation. So
absolutely.
I would think. And now this answer might be exactly the same, and that would be fine. But we like to think about sort of a very holistic question around, well, the question is, if you could get one message into the hearts and minds of every human on Earth and be truly heard and understood, what would that be?
There's no free lunch in the universe. This is one of the, it's like Barry Commoner's laws of ecology. One of the laws is this one, which I think is the most important one, is there is no free lunch. You will always have trade-offs. Be willing to consider and embrace trade-offs. Don't think there is a utopian single solution. Once you understand that, it'll make your life less stressful, and you'll be a better decision maker on especially environmental decisions.
Love that. We haven't had that one before. That's very good. And finally, how can people buy your book? How can they support your work? Soil to Foil, where is it available?
Yes, so it's available online. There's both the print edition and the electronic edition, and there will also be an audio edition with Earthly Order, my other book, which came out last year. So these are available through the online booksellers or directly from the publisher, Columbia University Press for Soil to Foil, Oxford University Press for Earthly Order. And Earthly Order is already in audiobook form as well. So for those of you who are interested in audio, it's on Audible. With Earthly Order, I'm donating all the royalties for environmental education programs, because that book was written especially for making sure the public has a better understanding of environmental systems. And it's fairly affordable, available in all over in Australia as well, US, everywhere. Oxford is the world's largest university press, so they're all over the world too.
Fantastic. Love the Audible version. That makes life so much easier. So thank you for getting it up on Audible.
Yeah.
So Dr. Ali, thank you so much for sharing this fascinating look at aluminum. I hope for a fruitful closing to COP28 and indeed a very positive 2024 where we make massive strides and progress in aluminum and everything else too.
Great. Thank you so much, Joy.
Thank you for listening to this episode with Dr. Ali. Key takeaways for me is that solutions are complex and we need to understand the nuances of environmental and social problems that we're collectively facing so that we can solve them more thoughtfully and faster. I hope you enjoyed that conversation and learned a little bit more about the nuances of aluminum. Thanks again, and we'll catch you next time.